Hello, this is the UCLA Housing Voice podcast, and I'm your host, Shane Phillips. This week's episode is with Professor Ryan Greenaway-McGrevy, and our subject is one that is definitely going to be of great interest to our listeners. In 2016, the city of Auckland, New Zealand, upzoned the vast majority of its land. And unlike some U.S. cities that have in recent years eliminated single-family zoning, but still only allow 2 or 3 units on each parcel, Auckland went big, allowing multifamily buildings of anywhere from 3 to 7 stories in about 3/4 of the city. To date, and to my knowledge, it's the biggest real-world test of the theory that not only will upzoning result in more housing, but more importantly, that it will help with housing affordability. The good but somewhat unsurprising news is that the upzoning pretty much worked as intended, and as economic theory would predict. I won't spoil the results too much here in the intro, but what I will say is that the results aren't as simple as upzone, build more housing, and prices go down. But they're also not too much more complicated than that. We dig into the details of what Auckland actually did, the results with respect to both housing production and housing prices, and what lessons this holds for other cities around the world. I really want to underscore how important and valuable it is to finally have a city that's tried the kinds of reforms people like us at the Lewis Center have been advocating for a long time, and it's really encouraging to see such positive results. The Housing Voice podcast is a production of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies with production support from Claudia Bustamante and Jason Suteja. Divine Mutoni has also been helping us out by updating our backlog of transcripts, starting with the most recent episodes, so feel free to check those out. You can email me at shanephillips@ucla.edu, and please take a moment, if you could, to give us a 5-star rating or a review, or tell a friend or colleague to check out the show. Now let's get to our conversation with Professor Ryan Greenaway-McGrevy. Ryan Greenaway-McGrevy is Associate Professor of Economics and Director of the Economic Policy Center at the University of Auckland, and he's here with us today to talk about what happened in Auckland after 3/4 of the city was upzoned, and upzoned quite significantly in 2016. Ryan, thanks for being here, and welcome to the Housing Voice podcast.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here, guys.
Pavo, you are my co-host today. Welcome.
Thanks, Shane. Hi, Brian. Kia ora.
Kia ora to you too.
Pavo's always got the culturally appropriate introduction.
Yep. I appreciate it. I
hang with people who live in Auckland lately, so.
Yeah. So we'll start, as we always do, with a tour from our guest. Ryan, I believe you will be our second guest to talk about Auckland, but I'm sure you'll have some different places to share. So if you were taking us around, wanted us to see some things, where would you take us?
Cool. So, firstly, welcome to Auckland. I assume I'm taking you two guys around, right?
Sure.
Can you swim?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Pavo?
I am afraid of jellyfish, but yes.
All right. Excellent. No, you're right to be afraid of jellyfish. No, they're good most of the time. All right, so we are going to, if I was going to show you around Auckland, we're going to go to a place called Goat Island, okay? But before we get there, I'll just provide a little bit of context for the listeners about Auckland itself. So Auckland's, the largest city in New Zealand, about 1.7 million people now. We're located on a large island, and we're on an isthmus between 2 harbours. We have the Waitemata to the north and the Manukau to the south. And so water and the sea plays a prominent role in a lot of people's lives and how they enjoy their lives in Auckland, and I'm one of them as well. If you're into hiking and greenery and parks and forests, we've got that stuff too, but I'm in charge of this trip, so sorry, we won't be seeing that today. So once you come to Auckland, we have a very temperate climate. You don't have to worry too much about what you're wearing day to day. You'll arrive, I'll show you around the CBD, I'll show you the restaurants and so forth, but really I'm hanging out and waiting for that first sunny day when there's no clouds in the sky, when there's no wind, and the water visibility is good. Because then we're going to jump in the car, we're going to drive about an hour and a quarter north of Auckland to this marine reserve called Goat Island. So it's a marine reserve, you can't fish there, you can't take anything from there. If it's a weekend, though, it's going to be packed. You're going to see a huge cross-section of Auckland society there. And if it's high tide, it's going to be standing room only. There's no room on the beach. Parking's going to be a pain, but it's all worthwhile in the end. I'll loan you guys some snorkeling gear. We'll jump in the water, and then once we're in the sea, you're going to see all kinds of amazing fish. You're going to see what the marine ecosystem was like before people arrived in mass numbers under colonization. So you're going to see lots of new fish, our most favorite fish to eat, the snapper. You'll see plenty of those. You'll see the blue mau, which is electric blue. You'll see stingrays, maybe some jellyfish, maybe not. They're usually quite small, maybe an octopus or two if we're lucky. If we put our heads under the water, you're going to hear the sea urchins, or kinna as they're known here, munching away at all the kelp. And it's going to be a totally immersive, sensory experience. There's going to be no time for thinking about housing or urbanism.
Can we talk about difference and differences underwater?
What difference and differences? Causal inference. It's going to be totally immersive. You're going to be right there in that space at the time.
I'm worried, though. Are these the same urchins that are eating all the kelp in California?
Yeah, they won't. They'll be a different species, but we have the same problem. So outside of the marine reserve, we refer to them as kinna barrens, where they're munching all the kelp away. And why they're doing that in great numbers? Because of overfishing. Their natural predators are gone. So if you want to see that, we can go out and see that as well. But to bring this back to Auckland and the topic of today's conversation, what this shows is that when you plan to have a more compact city, greater population density towards the CBD where everyone works, you can preserve, these natural amenities in locations that are easily accessible to everybody. It's an hour and a quarter north. Okay, if the traffic's bad, it'll take a bit longer if it's a nice day. But, I imagine if I was in LA, obviously it's a much larger city. But if I drive for an hour and a half, I'm still probably looking at houses, right? So, all those natural amenities, all the things that people really enjoy about living in Auckland, I think upzoning is a way, or greater population density is a way to preserve all those amenities while allowing a greater number of people to enjoy them. I'm looking forward to hosting you guys.
Fantastic. I'm ready to go.
Yeah, I have to ask, are there goats on Goat Island?
Yeah.
There are no, well, there might be. I've never seen one. But I believe it's called Goat Island because in earlier times when you had to be worried about food, sailors would drop off goats on these islands and know that they could come back to them and get a quick feed.
This is a big problem in I think it's the Galapagos, right, where they left goats there and then they ate all the plants that the turtles use as habitat, and then they have to go shoot all the goats. Yeah,
I mean, to be honest, when there's, I guess the Galapagos are protected as well, and I assume in large parts, but back in the day, of course, there was all this food, or kaimoana, as in the native Māori language, was all available, right?
Right.
Just under the surface.
All right. So there are two articles we're discussing today. The first one in Urban Studies, in which Ryan is joined by co-authors Gail Pacheco and Cade Sorensen. That one was published in 2020, and it's titled The Effect of Upzoning on House Prices and Redevelopment Premiums in Auckland, New Zealand. The second one has yet to be published in a peer-reviewed journal, but there's a discussion paper version from 2022 with co-author Peter C.B. Phillips, and that one's titled The Impact of Upzoning on Housing Construction in Auckland. As the titles, I think, make pretty clear, we're going to be talking about an upzoning that took place in Auckland, New Zealand, and the impacts that had on housing construction and housing prices. I was originally going to spoil this, but Pavo told me I should actually let Ryan spoil the results for both of these two papers. So Ryan, take it away. What's the headline results for both of these papers?
Yeah, so for the second paper that looks at housing construction, basically the punchline of that paper is that upzoning works to the extent that we see an increase in the number of permits being issued for housing units after the policy takes place. And these permits are predominantly occurring, or for the vast majority are in the upzoned areas of the city. Mm-hmm. So in the paper itself, we get a bit more technical and the econometrics and so forth. But that's the punchline, the takeaway from it, that it can, at least in the case of Auckland, that upzoning appears to have, or it has, encouraged an increase in the number of housing units being constructed. Mm-hmm. The earlier paper with Gail and Cade, this is looking at sort of the immediate or short-term price impacts, relative price impacts from the upzoning policy. So what we find there is that when you look at houses that, or existing properties, I should say, that are relatively underdeveloped, you might think of an old house sitting on a big piece of land. When houses like that were upzoned, you saw a big increase in their value, and we attribute that to the value of the underlying land. You can now fit more floor space on it, so that makes a certain amount of economic sense. But also what's interesting is that what we found is that when already intensively developed properties were upzoned, we actually saw those fall in value relative to similar properties in non-upzoned areas. So, if you go back far enough in Auckland's timeline, we did allow more intensive forms of development, but then we went through a sort of a downzoning that prevented that from happening anymore. So there are pockets where you do see more intensive forms.
Not unusual in that history by any stretch.
Yeah, yes. But both these results, I think, make a certain amount of economic sense. Regarding the upzoning of already intensively developed properties, well, these are the kinds of properties and the kinds of housing forms that upzoning is supposed to encourage. So seeing the price of those fall in neighbourhoods where there's going to be a lot more of them in the future if the policy is successful makes a certain amount of sense.
Yeah. I think it's important to note, and we'll get much more into the details here, but as intuitive as these results are, there's not a lot of evidence for the impacts of these kinds of policies because very few places have upzoned very significantly and particularly to the extent that Auckland did in 2016. So we'll get to that. But before we talk about the upzoning itself in more detail, let's talk about what motivated it. Some very important context here is that housing prices in New Zealand have been kind of out of control for at least the past decade. And the problem has been especially acute in Auckland. By some measures, Auckland is one of the least affordable cities in the world. And since most of our listeners won't be too familiar with Auckland's housing market or maybe anything about Auckland, could you say a bit about where things stood in terms of housing scarcity and housing affordability before this upzoning took place?
Yes, absolutely. So we haven't really built enough to keep up with our population growth in New Zealand. So there's been restricted supply and growing demand, and unsurprisingly, this has led to increasingly unaffordable housing. I think currently, although this might have changed more recently, but if you compare the median house price to median household income in Auckland, we're at about 10. That might have come down more recently because the bubble is beginning to burst a little bit. But that gives you an idea. So that's incredibly unaffordable. If you follow the demographia reports that are put out there, that they usually record those ratios. Auckland, some other cities in New Zealand and Australia always rank really highly. In terms of the scarcity, to give you an example, between 2013 and 2018, our population, those are the census years, that we have a census every 5 years. So that's when we get the most accurate information on our population and our housing stock. The population grew by about 10% over that 5-year period, but the number of occupied dwellings only grew by 5%. Right, so it's really a picture of where we're not keeping up and not providing enough housing to support our growing population.
And that might actually kind of understate the restrictions on housing or the scarcity of housing because, at some level, when you have less housing, when people have to overcrowd into it, people might have less children, population growth tends to slow. So they're not totally independent of each other.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm not sure if we want to get too much into it, but sort of the broader ramifications for society, I think, are far reaching. It's housing unaffordable, I think, is the number one or close to being the number one local problem that New Zealand faces. I mean, there are global problems like climate change and so forth, but, the high cost of housing eats away at people's real incomes. Inflation is going up everywhere currently as well, so budgets are further under pressure from that side of things. When you're spending a large proportion of your take-home income on the roof over your head, it's bad for welfare, and it has these longer-term problems, as you've touched on.
So let's get into what Auckland actually did, which was to upzone about 3/4 of the city in one fell swoop. And I should note that there are other places. Minneapolis would be an example that upzoned effectively the whole city, allowing for 3 units per
California
parcel.
upzoned the whole state.
California upzoned the whole state, allowing for technically 4 units on most, at least single family zone parcels. But these are really kind of modest upzones where what is allowed now versus what was allowed before, it's not that big a change. And in Auckland, that's just not really the case to the same extent. So in Auckland, the city now has 4 main residential zones, or they're the overwhelming majority of zones at least, with single house zoning being the most restrictive and the terrace houses and apartments zone being the least restrictive, meaning it allows the tallest and most dense buildings. A bit over 7% of the city is in that highest density zone after the adoption of what is called the Auckland Unitary Plan, which doesn't sound like too much, but now only 23% of land is zoned for single houses. And it maybe goes without saying, it was a lot more than that before.
It was like 3/4 before, right?
But now only about 23% of the land is zoned for single houses, and pretty much all the rest is in those middle zones, which do allow for multifamily housing of varying densities or intensities. In virtually every U.S. city, the vast majority of land zoned for residential uses is reserved for single-unit detached houses only. I think in San Jose, just as a kind of extreme example, it's around 90%, and that's a city of over 1 million people in the most economically productive region in the world. Ryan, could you share some more details on what Auckland zoning looked like prior to 2016 and how big a change this was? One thing that stood out to me is that this change increased the city's capacity for new homes by over 300%, at least on paper, which is just an astounding figure to me. Give us some more background on what they did to achieve that, what changes were made.
Yeah, so the Auckland upzoning came about when Auckland Council, as it's currently known, was formed. So prior to 2010, the Auckland metropolitan region, if you will, was comprised of 7 different city and district councils. Mm-hmm. And Auckland City Council, as it was known, was really restricted to this central isthmus that I mentioned earlier. So each one of those 7 areas, district councils, had their own land use planning laws that they enacted. And when you go back and look at them, although they did allow for, let's say some amounts of medium density, they were really restricted to very small areas of the city in particular neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. They weren't blanket zones, they were special zones. When you go back and look at, the amount of land that had this higher zoning, my estimates are that in terms of, say, terraced housing and apartments, what we now know as terraced housing and apartments, about, smaller than 2% of that was already zoned for this higher density level. So it was really a picture of, yeah, we do allow high density, but it's not happening across the city. It's really highly planned and restricted to these very small locations. Mm-hmm. In 2010, the central government passes legislation that says, all right, Auckland's going to amalgamate, the metro region's going to amalgamate and become the Auckland Council. This is much larger, spans, I think, about 4,000 plus square kilometres of land area, most of it rural, so it's a huge area now. And they would have to come up with a spatial plan and a uniform set of land use regulations, set of zones. And so out of that process, the council was quite ambitious. And as I understand it, without too much encouragement from the central government, really wanted to plan for a more compact population growth going forward. Not yet motivated by housing affordability, but motivated more by issues like climate change, congestion, planning that's more suitable for an urban topology that has, surrounded by 2 harbours. We're not on a flat plain like, say, Atlanta, where there's plenty of space. This occurred at a time, though, when house prices were just, appreciating by astounding amounts each year. 25% was not uncommon. Over several years, house prices have doubled very quickly. And so out of that process, in 2013, the first version of this plan was put to the public. There was some backlash. A lot of people were not happy in seeing how their neighbourhoods would change.
Always is.
Yep. There's, some, quite frankly, terrible behaviour at public meetings that occurred. But
also always is.
But yeah, from 2013, there was sort of this review process. The plan went several revisions. Because housing affordability became more of a concern, we saw the central government get involved. And there was a sort of overview from the central government that ensured that the final version of the plan ended up being quite ambitious. It did go back to the Auckland Council, but, they could only, my understanding is that they could only query the points made by, or the changes made by the government based on points of law. And so basically the Unitary Plan went through with the Council's approval in this form that allowed for, as you say, if you look at these, I don't know how much trust I put in these capacity assessment numbers because, it ignores the economics, and I'm an economist. Are these dwelling? Yeah, are they feasible or not? Are they in places that people want to live and so forth? Yeah. You can always game these things, but this massive increase, at least in terms of planned capacity, came about through it. And subsequently, we've seen, the beginnings of not only an increase in the number of housing permits being issued, but, big increase in the number of multifamily attached units being built, all of which I think suggests that it's really been successful and at least encouraging supply.
I was really struck by the fact that the plan became more ambitious in subsequent iterations. I guess so. You're saying that was mostly because of the central government's input?
Yes, my understanding is that the first version of it was quite ambitious. There was a councillor and the mayor realised that they may not be around for much longer, and so it was pulled back slightly. But then the final version came through. One of the big things the final version did was abolish minimum lot sizes, for example. And so
that plays a big part in these townhouses that I've seen a lot of cool pictures of. I was hoping you could speak more to because there's a lot of the new zones. There's two new zones called the multi-house suburban and multi-house urban. And do you know how those were developed in terms of the specific standards that they impose on housing? Because one thing that's the big difference between the Auckland Unitary Plan and the Minneapolis rezoning and California's SB9 is it was done in a way that was clearly effective in allowing developers to use the new rules, right? So we just had this report in California that nobody's using this law we passed a year ago that would allow, in theory, 2 duplexes on every lot. So I guess the question is, how were these 2 townhouse producing zones developed? And I guess is the minimum lot size issue there a big factor?
Do you mean, when you say developed, do you mean how did they come about, or how are they being developed?
How did they create the new rules that actually led to so much production?
I don't have a big insight into why those MHS and MHU, mixed housing suburban and mixed housing urban, were specified the way they are, but it's clear that there's sort of a gradation in terms of intensity between the single house zone and the terraced housing zone. And if you look at the planning maps, what you'll typically see is that certain areas have been targeted for that terraced housing zone where there's going to be greater density, and it'll be surrounded by mixed housing urban, which is slightly more restrictive, and then mixed housing suburban, and then single house. So there's kind of a gradual transition that I believe is to preserve some sort of visual amenity. But mixed housing suburban, I can say, is while, in practice, these lots are being developed to a higher standard or fitting more in than if you were just looking at the land use regulation that you'd expect.
Right.
And so,
because these are minimum density thresholds, but developers can get consent to build more, right?
They're maximum in the sense that on paper there's a maximum effective, let's say, talk about a floor to land area ratio. If you take there are building envelopes and so forth, but if you just imagine you had a nice square piece of land, the site coverage ratio and the number of stories are going to determine how much floor space you are as of right allowed to put on that piece of land. Now, you can apply for exemptions from as of right development. And so that's where I believe a lot of developers are coming into the MHS zone and exceeding it. Just one more thing I should mention. Mixed housing suburban is now gone because of national level upzoning policies.
This is the famous 2021.
Yeah, this is the medium density residential standard, which was a central government initiative that we can perhaps talk about a bit later. But so mixed housing suburban is, it was in effect from November 2016 through to very recently, and now most of those mixed housing suburban zones are now the equivalent of mixed housing urban. Right, 3 stories, 45% site coverage ratio as of right.
Okay, that's helpful. I was going to ask just for a quick clarification. So we've got, when mixed housing suburban existed, it was 2 stories, 40% lot coverage, meaning you could only build a structure on up to 40% of the parcel area. Mixed housing urban is this 3-story, 45% lot coverage, and then terrace houses and apartments is quite a bit bigger. This is 5 to 7 stories, 50% lot coverage. So, but I think that's important to note, even the highest density, we're talking 5 to 7 stories, at least by right. You could presumably go higher if you request special permissions, but we're not talking about, requiring skyscraper development here to achieve
Correct.
the things that we're going to talk about were achieved. I also just want to make one last point here, which is that you kind of talked about this, Ryan, a little bit, but this is not like past upzonings or past zoning practices where this density is really concentrated in a few places. If you look at a map, and we will include a link to one in the show notes, this is really, all of these zones are found kind of throughout the city, and they're certainly concentrated more toward the center, but it covers, we're talking 3/4 of the city, it covers most of it. And so this is not something where it's just a few neighborhoods getting all the change, all of the housing being built in them.
For the most part, I will just quickly interject.
Tell us about special character areas.
Yes, special character areas where the character is more special. So this is a kind of a heritage preservation zone. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the single house zoning that exists in Auckland, it's in two places. One, either around the CBD and the neighborhoods immediately around the CBD, or further away as you get to the semi-rural areas. And the reason why there's a lot of single house zoning in those central areas is that there's also an additional layer of regulation, a special overlay, that's designed to encourage preservation of these homes that were built prior to the 1940s. So there's a very distinctive style of architecture that was predominant in Auckland through this time. We've referred to them as villas. And, they are pleasing to the eye. I can understand why people want to have these neighborhoods preserved. But policy is all about trade-offs, right? And so there is a trade-off in the sense that all of this land that's located very close to where the jobs are is not zoned for higher density housing. Mm-hmm. So grappling with that, who benefits from this visual amenity?
Presumably these villas are quite expensive relative to most other housing options.
Yes, they are expensive. They occur all over the country, and in Auckland, they're very much prized because a lot of money has been poured back into them. As you can imagine, construction technology the potential for construction technology has only gotten better over time. Back in the turn of the previous century, once you look under these houses, you're sort of astounded that they're still standing up unless they've been repiled. Unless they've been insulated properly, they're very cold and damp. They can be colder inside than outside somehow on a cold day. In other parts of the country, because they haven't been kept up very frequently, they're not viewed as high status and consequently are cheaper.
Right. But yeah, I mean, I'm doing some research with William Chung, previous guest, and Edward Yu at the University of Auckland, and we're building off your work, Ryan. And one of the things we're looking at is probability of a single house neighborhood getting upzoned under the AUP. And you might not be surprised to learn that higher income neighborhoods were much less likely to have their zoning changed, right? So a lot of the single house zones didn't have their zoning changed, and those were richer.
Yep, that's absolutely the case. To be fair, there are some wealthy areas of Auckland that did still receive upzoning, sort of the eastern suburbs. But sort of the history of Auckland's quite interesting in the sense that, for a period of time, these neighbourhoods that had these old homes were not where wealthy people lived. If you go back to the 70s, some of these neighbourhoods were where lower income families lived. And because of that, they were kind of preserved. Not because of zoning, but because no one had the money to put back into them. Right. And it was, high status people lived in newer homes. Right. It's subsequent to that, they sort of gentrified. And they gentrified at the time when we were having more down zoning. And so, a lot of these inner city areas, Ponsonby, Greyland, I'm mentioning these areas since you're doing research on them, whereas they were sort of, very much working class suburbs back in the day, are now incredibly expensive and for the higher income groups.
All right, so I think that's a good amount of context for how this came about, what was actually done. So now we can get into the findings of these articles. And I think the first one we should discuss is the one on housing production with your co-author, Peter Phillips, because it's a little more straightforward. There are people out there who will say that upzoning won't lower housing prices or can't lower housing prices because developers would never build so much housing that property values or rents would fall or significantly, slow down. And implicit in that argument is this idea that the amount of housing being built today is pretty much exactly the amount the developers want to build. Therefore, upzoning is essentially unnecessary. It won't achieve anything. I don't want to give that perspective too much credit because I do think it's a pretty marginal one, but it's definitely out there. It's something you will hear. And your research, I think, refutes that pretty decisively, at least in the context of Auckland. So to set this up, for this study, you looked at two sets of parcels, those that were upzoned in 2016 and those that were not. And you compared the housing production trends before and after 2016 for those upzoned parcels and those non-upzoned areas. If I were a betting man, I would expect production to increase in the upzoned areas as new development opportunities were created, and actually maybe to decrease in the non-upzoned areas as development shifted elsewhere, at least relative to kind of where the trend lines were headed. But for overall production to rise, you actually need the increase in production in upzoned areas to be larger than the decrease in non-upzoned areas. Again, all of this is relative to the trends up until 2016. So what did you actually find?
A story very similar to the one that you described there, Shane.
It worked.
It worked, absolutely. So, I mean, are you going to show some of the graphics from the paper? Earlier you mentioned you were going to show some maps.
Yes, we will. We'll have the map of the upzoned parcels, and I will also be sure to add the very dramatic chart showing, before and after the meteoric rise of attached dwellings in particular that took place after 2016. We'll link to that for sure.
Yes. So if you look at a simple time series plot of the number of permits occurring in these upzoned areas, they track along, they're tracking up slightly until 2016 when the policy occurs, and then there's sort of a meteoric rise. Each year, it's trending up. Mm-hmm. And, 5 years on, they're still trending up. So to be clear, we're not sure what the total impact's going to be. It's still happening as we speak.
Yeah.
Then if we look at those non-upzoned areas, they are trending up as well over time. They get to about 2015, and then there's a slight decrease, right? But that slight decrease relative to trend is far smaller than the massive increase that we're seeing in these upzoned areas of the city. So the paper gets into the weeds a bit more, is a bit more technical, but that's the summary of it. And, in order to break that result, you really have to be trying to find some other policy or some other event that occurred right in 2016 that could account for this huge rise over a short period of time in building permits. And look, building's not a terribly volatile industry, right? If you look at a longer time series, you don't see such a fast and swift change in the trend, at least in New Zealand.
Can you talk about the numbers a little bit here, just in terms of, especially in the upzoned areas and particularly for attached dwellings, meaning basically multifamily housing? Where was it at, in 2015 or 2016, and where has it gotten to, or where is it headed to up to 2021?
Yep. So I'll quote directly from the paper here because I was looking at the visual, but I know we talk about these numbers specifically. And if we just look at attached dwellings, in 2016, there were about 1,000 permitted attached dwellings in Auckland. By 2021, we've got about 10,000, right? So that's over a 5-year period, a tenfold increase.
Wow.
If we look at the total number of dwellings in upzoned areas, gone from about 2,500 right in 2016. Now we're building close to 14,000 in 2020. That's 2021. Mm-hmm. And, very shortly, my good friends at Auckland Council have the data for 2022. So I'm looking forward to updating these. And that's that's in the upzoned areas. In terms of non-upzoned areas, there's a slight decrease, roughly from, out to 2020, it's probably flat. 2022.
Ryan, I don't remember whether you're able to distinguish between townhouses. Townhouses would be considered attached, as would apartment buildings. Are you able to distinguish between those two building types? And then are you able to distinguish between different zones, the multi-house versus the terraced housing zones?
So we can't, not on the data set that I have access to. It's either attached or detached, and that's as close as we can get. A lot of the detached housing that we see being built, particularly in that mixed housing suburban area, you've got a a couple of meters between the walls, if that. So it's it's often very close to being attached. But no, we can't. At least in the data sets that I have access to, and I'm not sure we'd have access to this to distinguish a terraced house from an apartment block.
Right, but you haven't separated between the MH and the TH zones in terms
yes,
of
we can do that. Yep.
Oh,
we can separate between those two. Yep, absolutely.
That'd be interesting to see where it's happening.
Yes. So I can. The paper does get into that towards the end, and from memory, the majority of the construction is happening in the MHS zone. Right. And that's by virtue of it's a larger land area, right? But relative to land area, a disproportionate amount is still happening in the terraced housing areas, right?
Right.
One figure that really stood out to me was, you're attributing about 5% growth in the housing stock above what you would have expected without this upzoning because of the upzoning over basically a 5 or 6 year period. And so almost like an additional 1% growth in the housing stock per year, again, in addition to where the trends were already headed. Is that right? It was something like 27,000 additional homes that would not have existed, presumably, or as far as we can tell, would not have been built if not for this upzoning?
Close. There's about 27,000 additional permits.
Okay.
What we don't have good data on are the number of demolitions. And we won't... Census years are what we have to wait for to get the best, most accurate measure of the housing stock. Because Auckland Council does not require a permit to demolish a home unless it's over 3 stories. Most homes are not over 3 stories. It's not going to show up in the data. And so that's the caveat that we have to add to that 5% figure. It gives you an idea of the size of the effect, right, relative to the dwelling stock. But we can't tell how many of those older homes were torn down and replaced.
Yeah.
We make some assumptions, wave our hands a bit in the paper and say, under this various assumptions, you might think that we can expect a 4% increase in the dwelling stock.
Yeah.
Basically, from recollection of the paper, we say if we've got a permit that has more than one dwelling on it, and so you can have a single permit that has, say, 10 units or 1 unit, and there was a happening within the urban extent of Auckland, then we'll assume that one house was demolished in order to make way for those 10, so 9 additional permits. And anything outside that urban extent is greenfield development and an increase. Doing that, I think we come back to a figure of 4%-ish, maybe high 3s. But yeah, we can't be sure, and that's an important point to make clear.
Yeah, and I think given the results of your other paper, which we're going to discuss, and how redevelopment premiums were greater for less intensively developed properties that were upzoned, we might expect properties with fewer homes on them or smaller homes on them to have been the ones that were demolished in favor of redevelopment. But we'll get to there. As I'm listening to both of your backgrounds too, it's striking me as funny that Ryan is the one in Auckland, a kind of more, at least from my perspective, exotic location, but it sounds like Pavo's the one in the rainforest with all the birds in the background.
I do have budgies. I got noisy budgies.
But that's fine. It makes me feel like I'm there. So that is the more straightforward paper, I think, on housing production. And I think we can leave it at that for now. Auckland upzoned a lot. Housing production shifted toward the upzoned areas, and overall production increased pretty dramatically. That's that story. Your other article is about the impact of the upzoning on house prices and the price of land, basically, through redevelopment premiums. And this is a bit more complicated. In previous episodes, we have talked about how when new housing is built, there's sort of a tug of war that occurs between supply effects and demand effects. Demand effects are sometimes also called amenity effects. Episode 5 with Evan Mast is a really good conversation on this. The supply effect is this idea that if you increase the supply of homes, landlords have to compete harder to get tenants, and that will tend to push prices down. This is oversimplifying, but just high level. The amenity or demand effect posits that new housing may increase the aesthetic appeal or add new amenities to a neighborhood, like restaurants or retail or whatever. And that would tend to push
That
prices.
is, unless it destroys the character of the neighborhood, in which case it would lower the prices of everything nearby.
But other than that, if that doesn't happen, which many people are afraid of, that would tend to push prices and rents up for nearby homes. Most research to date, again, pointing back to Evan Mast and others, has found that the supply effect dominates. Compared to a scenario where new housing hadn't been built or less housing had been built, building more helps lower the price of nearby homes. That body of research is focused on the value of housing to the people who want to live in it. But that's not the only interest people have in buying real estate, and in some cases, real estate that has housing on it. Some people, namely developers, want to buy real estate so they can redevelop it to a higher intensity or another use. And because they have very different intentions for the property, they assign it value in a very different way than a home buyer or a renter might. That value is heavily determined by zoning and other regulations, and that's where we come to the concepts of real options and redevelopment premiums, which you talk about in this other paper. Could you say a bit about the difference between how a home buyer assesses the value of a property compared to a developer, and what role zoning plays in that assessment? What do real options and redevelopment premiums mean, or why do they matter in that context?
As you mentioned there, Shane, for an owner-occupier, obviously is going to view purchasing a given property through a very different lens than a developer, although there'll be some overlap with regards to the desirability of the neighbourhood and so forth. Mm-hmm. A developer's looking at the potential for that site, right? Typically. Whereas a homeowner or prospective homeowner is not, although, we do have homeowners that pull down houses and rebuild, of course. But by and large, a developer's more concerned with, well, if I tear this down, how much housing can I fit on in its place and what price does that new housing fetch? And so, various economic models would predict that those properties that are suddenly had their zoning restrictions relaxed to allow much greater density are going to receive high demand from developers, and that they're going to bid the price of those parcels up as they compete with one another to purchase that price and ultimately to redevelop it. Now, I think it conforms with economic intuition that when you've been in a zoning regime where zoning regulations have really restricted how a parcel or a given neighbourhood can be developed, and those restrictions are suddenly relaxed, provided that neighbourhood's in a desirable area, perhaps close to where the jobs are or so forth, or close to some natural amenities, that there's a lot of latent demand from potential home buyers to live in that area, that we'd see an increase in the property values and an increase in the value of the land in particular underlying those properties when those regulations are relaxed, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that erodes housing affordability, right? Mm-hmm. Land's an input to housing supply, right? And land costs are what we should be worried about overall. Land costs are really the quantity of land that you need to purchase times the price. And really we should be thinking about how much land do I have to purchase to produce a given dwelling or a given amount of floor space. So even though the land price goes up, because those regulations have allowed developers to purchase much less land per unit, land costs can still fall overall.
Right.
So a worked example, maybe a given area is upzoned, the value of the property doubles as a result. But if you can fit 8 units on there now instead of the one that's currently sitting there, you've still got a fourfold reduction in land costs.
Yeah. The per unit land costs are the real costs. Measure.
That's right. Exactly. And so we did see those price effects in Auckland when a given, particularly homes that had a low improvement value, maybe their small improvements value being the value of the physical capital, the house structure itself. Perhaps they're small or perhaps they're old and run down. If that capital value was low relative to the land value, when those properties were upzoned, we saw an increase in price, and that conforms with our economic intuitions. On average, across all upzoned areas of Auckland, the latest version of our construction paper has a little robustness check, suggests about a 25% increase on average in land prices across all those 3 zones we mentioned. Mm-hmm. The flip side is, of course, you can fit many more dwellings onto that piece of land. In that paper with Gale and Cade, we talk about the redevelopment option to sort of reflect this the fact that developers are looking at the potential of the site. So an option, a real option, is the right to change the structure of the dwelling that sits on that house, the right to redevelop it. You don't have to do it, right? But you still retain the legal right to do that at a future point in time. And so the point we're making is that once you implement that upzoning policy, you inflate the value of that. You create the real option, I should really be saying, because you couldn't develop it to a higher standard before. And that's going to be reflected in the price that those properties ultimately sell for once developers get involved and bid up the prices. And that's nothing to be too worried about, provided you're not seeing a massive increase in land prices, right? That's all part of the process that we should expect.
Yeah, and I think this paper is such an important contribution to this growing literature because, there have been other papers that show, the upzoning had an impact for no apparent reason, right? So I'm thinking about this Yona Freemark paper, which was a nice paper and has been discussed at length. But, there are some cases where it was these condo buildings that didn't really have redevelopment potential where the prices were going up. And that's doesn't really make economic sense because actually the only impact of the upzoning that should increase value is the option to redevelop, right?
And it's once that option to redevelop is exercised, that's the point in time when we should be looking for the price effects, right? It's once the developer pulls down that house, replaces them with 4 housing units, and that's happening en masse across the city in all these different locations.
Right.
What are the prices that those units are selling for or renting for? We don't really want to focus on the price appreciation in these underdeveloped upzoned properties, right? We want to focus on the price of the forms of housing that the policy is designed to encourage. Because really it's a policy that's changing the urban structure from a, single family detached housing on 600 square meters of land to multifamily housing sitting on perhaps 100 to 200 square meters of land per dwelling.
Yep.
I write about this concept in different contexts because it really interests me, and I don't really have the appropriate terminology for it. But, I think what's happening here is basically there's the value to someone who wants to essentially maintain what is there. So we can imagine, say, here in Los Angeles, like a duplex that might be valued to someone who wants to buy it and rent it out or live in one unit and rent out the other. They might value that at, say, $800,000, depending where it's at. That would be, unfortunately, a pretty cheap duplex in Los Angeles at this point.
Same here.
If you can't build more than 2 units, or maybe you can only build 3 units on there, and the value kind of in the neighborhood or the general area is about $100,000 per developable unit, per unit that you can build, then the value to someone who wants to buy that property for $800,000 and just kind of keep it what it is much higher than what a developer is going to value at it. Because again, if you can only build 3 units, every kind of potential unit is worth about $100,000. They're only going to value it about $300,000. They're just not going to be interested in buying that because the person who wants to maintain it is going to win that bid, basically. If suddenly you can build 15 units on that parcel, now that property is worth $1.5 million to the developer, but the value to the person who wants to buy and maintain the duplex is still $800,000. So you've shifted who is willing to pay more for that. And suddenly what was clearly just going to stay a duplex now is very likely to eventually sell to a developer and become 15 units. And so I think that distinction is really important. And it's something we've talked about before, but I just want to really drive that home for the listeners.
Yep.
You started to get at this a little bit, but I think the core finding of this article is summarized in these 3 sentences near the conclusion. A consistent pattern emerges. The impact of zoning on prices diminishes as intensity increases. Beyond a sufficiently high intensity, the upzoned property depreciates relative to similar properties that were not upzoned. That's maybe a little hard for non-economists to parse, so elaborate on that for us if you could. What are you saying there, and what does it mean in practical terms for people who are concerned about housing abundance and consequently housing affordability?
Yeah, so there's a key word in there that I'll clarify. We talk about intensity, and that's a measure of the degree to which a given parcel has been developed, right? So it's a measure that lies between 0 and 1, but basically if you have vacant land, the site intensity is 0, right? And you might have a parcel with an old house on it that's equivalent to vacant land in the sense that the structure on it is worthless. It's just the land.
It might even be worse than vacant land.
It could be, yes.
To tear it down.
Yep, exactly. And so what we're saying in that statement is, although we've got this continuous measure of intensity that we apply to all properties, to explain what's going on, I'm going to pivot to two specific examples. So on the one hand, you could imagine a small house, very old, sitting on a big plot of land, has a very low site intensity in the sense that most of the value of that property is in the land. When that property is upzoned, we see that it appreciates in price. This is tracking sales data in that particular paper. It appreciates relative to a similar house that was not upzoned, right? So that perfectly conforms with our economic intuition. The value of that land has gone up because the potential to redevelop it into more than what it currently is. You might have 8 housing units there in the future, right? At the other end of the scale, we've got those already highly developed parcels. Perhaps they have, it's a parcel of land that has 8 units on it. Units are something we use in New Zealand, might be a unique terminology, but we also call them granny flats. They're sort of attached housing with 2 bedrooms and a kitchen and a bathroom and a living space for retired people. They're quite common, though increasingly we're seeing, families trying to fit into them because we've got a housing problem, lack of housing.
We also say granny flats, although I'm not sure they have exactly the same meaning. Pavo, do you know? I mean, it sounds pretty similar.
Yeah, I think ours would be smaller.
Their accessory dwelling units is the sort of technical name we give them here.
Okay, yeah. So if those already existing, relatively high intensity properties were upzoned, they fell in value relative to similar properties, similar granny flats in non-upzoned areas.
Mm-hmm.
How does this relate to housing affordability and abundance, observing these phenomena? Well, first point is to say that we should expect price appreciation in those parcels that have a large land endowment when they're upzoned. That's part of the process. It's nothing to be too worried about. And on the flip side, we've seen that these already intensively developed properties were depreciated in relative value once they were upzoned. And that's kind of interesting because if you think of sort of demand for housing being highly segmented by suburb, which there is some integration across the city, but I think to some degree you will see demand very specific to different suburbs. That observation that the value of those units has depreciated is consistent with a view that the market is expecting more supply in those areas of those kinds of units, high intensity, and consequently we're seeing a fall in their price. Now, it's consistent with other stories as well, right? So I'm not laying claim to causality here. I'm just saying that's one way to interpret that finding. And again, these two patterns that we observe, another way that it's important for people concerned with housing affordability, just coming back to that idea that when you're concerned with housing affordability, you should be tracking the price of those more intensive housing forms, apartments, units, terraced housing, tracking their prices over time, not paying attention to the price of housing that still has a rather large land endowment where the value of the property is in the land. Those are going to appreciate, right, reflecting that redevelopment option, and that's fine. Mm-hmm. It's those other housing forms that we should be focusing on, seeing if those are falling in absolute price.
Yeah.
After the policies implemented.
I think another way to look at this is it would be bad if prices increased as a result of the upzoning, but development didn't. Since at some level, the benefit of upzoning leading to increased prices is it's inducing more sales and sales specifically to developers to increase the supply of housing, which then, the hope and expectation, and most research points that this is actually happening, would lower prices market-wide. And so I think that's an important point to make here too.
Ryan, I wonder if you've thought about an additional research project focusing on certain neighborhoods. One of the things about, allowing more intensive forms of development on single house zones in places in California is I think there are still some neighborhoods where if you allowed 4plexes or 5plexes, extremely rich people want mansions to a price tag that's higher than 5 families condos would be, right? So I wonder if in different neighborhoods you're not seeing the redevelopment premium have as big of an effect. Like you could even test that using the same framework, right?
No, that's a really interesting point, and it's something I hadn't thought of. I think it would be hard to disentangle that from... There's a counteracting effect in that, the sense that a lot of these wealthy neighborhoods are places that people would like to live. And if you have if you've just zoned a corner off, right, in one of these character neighborhoods, you kind of get the benefits of living in a new apartment, right? But you're still surrounded by this visual amenity.
Yeah, you're a parasite on that.
That's right. That's right. You'll not be popular. The local lobby groups will. You're gonna have to work harder to integrate into the social
those boundaries
fabric.
Would be interesting to look at in particular, right? Those edge neighborhoods.
But
I can imagine even there's probably some neighborhood that did get rezoned to multi-house where there's not a lot of development happening because the people that want mansions have more money than the developers. Maybe there's not as bad of an income inequality in Auckland as there is in California, but we definitely have neighborhoods in LA where you would have to allow 10 units in order for them to outcompete a mansion.
Yeah, I take your point, and I think you have hit on that. We do have inequality, and I don't think it's as comparable as in the US, but it is there, and it has been growing over time. Anecdotally, I'm thinking about... I don't drive through the very wealthy neighborhoods that much.
We have to get to UCLA because they surround them on every side.
We have to look at them every day. It's
terrible. Where this whole research project, ultimately where I want to take it when we get some more data, is to see how upzoning has changed the socio-economic demographic of the neighborhoods that were most affected. Because there are areas, notwithstanding what you've said about character areas, and this is indeed where the very wealthy live, at least in terms of high schools, their catchment zones are quite large. In New Zealand, I believe it'll be similar to the US. Your address determines your access to public schooling, and unsurprisingly, the more wealthier neighborhoods tend to have better outcomes at high school. But even within some of the most prestigious public schools in Auckland, their catchment zones, there's been a lot of upzoning occurring. So we're really interested to see whether or not upzoning has encouraged greater social mobility. If you see I'm not expecting massive things out of this, but do you see a bit more of a tendency back towards the mean in terms of the household incomes of the families living in these neighborhoods that had greater amounts of upzoning, or not? A lot of people are worried about upzoning and gentrification. Like maybe we see an exacerbation of geographic inequality as a result. I don't know. But it's something that I'm definitely interested in pursuing.
I feel like there's an opportunity here for a research project that's basically looking at the potential for de-gentrification, which is just something we don't talk about at all in the US because it's, we haven't created the conditions almost anywhere for that to happen. Yeah. But this kind of upzoning does seem to at least pose that possibility. I did want to talk quickly here about when you have these dynamics happening where these lower value, lower intensity properties are appreciating more quickly because of an upzoning, it seems like there's a potential for a kind of win-win in which homeowners with these low intensity and ultimately kind of lower quality, lower value homes see their property values go up, which is good for economic equity. They're kind of catching up to other homeowners at least. And at the same time, I think the hope, at least, is we would also expect rents to go down relative to if these new homes hadn't been built. And that's good for economic equity for renters vis-a-vis homeowners. And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that or what your views are on.
Oh, I totally agree on the win-win. And in fact, maybe 2015, 2016, I wrote an op-ed in our national paper that was trying to make that case with reference to the Unitary Plan, saying that, we've got a housing problem. I'd call it a crisis. And at the same time, we've also got, many middle-class households that have saved through their property, right? Like, it's not uncommon in New Zealand for a family's retirement plan or a person's retirement plan or a couple's retirement plan to be their house.
Yeah.
And they want to sell it and then move to the countryside and have some disposable income as a result. We kind of, we're very much a property obsessed nation.
It's not a great way to structure an economy, but it is the way that we have set things up, and a lot of people have become reliant on it. And if we can help the people kind of at the bottom of that spectrum, better than doing nothing.
Yeah. So if there was a way to, achieve housing affordability and allow younger New Zealanders and families to have access to housing that's good quality, close to where they work, et cetera, that would be great. But, if it comes at the cost of people losing their retirement plan, I can see how that's going to be a political problem. So at least for those people who have saved by owning that single house on a plot of land, upzoning, in terms of pure monetary self-interest, it's a good thing for them. Now, ironically, once this upzoning occurred, there were plenty of stories that sort of tugged at the heartstrings of readership and got all the clicks and got the newspapers more money. But, we're saying things like, a young family, they saved up, just bought this house, and a developer's bought the section next to them, and then they bought the section behind them, and they're going to redevelop into terraced housing. And I'm like, you're a millionaire. You've just made, why aren't you selling to them? They'll want to buy it off you, increase the site footprint, parcel the land together, and you can go off and buy that same house elsewhere.
I can have a tiny amount of sympathy that you had these plans, this is where you wanted to live and so forth, but as far as compensation goes for your plans not coming to fruition, suddenly your home you bought for $600,000 or $1 million is worth twice that. That's a pretty good payoff. And I think compared to all the challenges that anyone who hasn't bought a home yet, renters have faced in New Zealand, in the US, it just doesn't rate.
Exactly.
I do, while we're on the subject of rents, I want to acknowledge and make clear that we haven't talked much about how this upzoning affected housing prices for the typical home buyer and especially the impact on rents. We've kind of focused on these upstream prices, which mostly only have an impact on prices for home buyers and rents for renters, depending on how those upstream changes in land prices affect housing production down the road. Redevelopment premiums and especially construction levels are super important, but for me, and I think all of us here, they're really just a means to an end, and that end is to make housing more affordable, as well as the other benefits that come with increasing housing density in urban, transit-rich, job-rich areas, particularly kind of wealthier and higher opportunity locations. To the extent that you or other researchers are already looking into this, what are you seeing in terms of housing prices kind of writ large and rents since the adoption of this Auckland Unitary Plan upzoning, and maybe also the federal or the central government changes that have been made more recently? Should we expect some forthcoming research on this?
Yeah, it's certainly an area that we're continuing to look at. And we will have, hopefully this year we'll put out at least one paper on house prices and or possibly rents in those absolute terms. But it's, with any policy evaluation exercise, it's difficult to articulate the counterfactual. And I think particularly hard when it comes to house prices, because I've seen this argument put forth a lot, and it's not an argument against upzoning, I'd say, but like many other places around the world, house prices went bananas in Auckland in the COVID period, even accounting for, with your price indices that account for compositional shifts, which is what we'd want to account for sort of the...
What do you mean by compositional shifts?
So, if you just paid attention to median house prices or average house sales prices, you don't know if a fall in house prices in a given quarter is due to the fact that house prices are really falling, or it's the fact that you just had more apartments being sold that period, and apartments tend to sell for less than detached single-family housing. So price indices that can account for those kind of shifts are a better measure of what the average house price is doing. So house prices in Auckland were flat kind of from 2017 through to, they ticked up a little bit before COVID, and then COVID hit, and we have this, interest rates fell through the floor. Our government came through with wage subsidies to make sure people don't lose their sources of income and maintain their jobs. And our central bank, for some strange reason, decided this would be a good time to relax macro-prudential regulations on new mortgages. This meant that there were restrictions there to ensure that you're not borrowing too much. I thought this was a good time to remove those. This is a big head scratcher from my perspective. Right on the eve of a 1 in 100 year pandemic, this is the time that you decide to encourage more risky lending. So, right. So, the pandemic wasn't as bad economically in the sense that everyone kept their jobs, kept their income. Well, we borrowed against the future generations will have to pay this off. But economically, at least, things weren't that bad. But interest rates were through the floor, and these restrictions that really were binding were removed, and house prices took off again. But, this is a lesson that when people point this out, I say, well, whenever you're evaluating a policy, the state of the world immediately prior to the policy is not a useful counterfactual at all. You have a whole array of confounding events and factors, like a 1 in 100 year pandemic and the response to it. That means you can't attribute causality at all, right? So that's the first argument we'll shoot down. We haven't seen an absolute fall in house prices. We had a bunch of other events that I think are quite credible at explaining what happened there. What we have seen, and on top of this, I should say that we've got the problem of how do we account for the value of land and the fact that upzoning inflates the value of land, as we mentioned before, that sort of conflates these average measures.
In the short term, you might have seen these prices go up, and that would be reflected as like an increase in house prices, but it's actually the sort of precursor to increased production and the downward pressure that would put on rents and home prices.
Exactly. So you have to, exactly. And because of that, how do you account for the value of land? You can do something complicated like we did in that second urban studies paper that I mentioned. You bring in this measure of site intensity, or you could just look at rents, right? Because rents don't reflect, they might reflect the sort of amenities associated that with a given location that are embodied in the value of land, right? But they don't. Well, they change slowly over time, I guess, but they certainly don't lay claim to the redevelopment option, which, is substantial in terms of its value.
We've talked about this, I think, in particular in our episode with Dan Kuhlman, episode 10. But yeah, so there's the land aspect of things, but there's also just with buying a home, even if, you're not really concerned about the land, there are these expectations that get capitalized into the price. So if you expect that prices are going to keep going up 10% a year, you're going to be willing to pay more. Whereas as a renter, the rent you're paying is really just based on like, what is the value to me as a person right now? Maybe there's a little bit of expectation about like this new light rail line is going to open up soon and I want to be like in place before that. But for the most part, it's just like, what is this worth right now? Nothing else really matters. And so in that sense, it's a great measure if you can get the data.
Yep, absolutely. So we do have rental data. We can, in terms of coming back to this policy evaluation exercise, what's articulating the counterfactual in this case, what would have happened in Auckland in the absence of the policy. On social media, people are comparing Auckland to rental price appreciation in other nearby cities. Wellington, which is our capital, could compare to some Australasian cities perhaps as well. So that's one way you could think about evaluating the impact on rents. And there are some nifty causal inferential techniques that one can deploy if you're a nerd and into those kind of things like me.
Are you able to say anything about the comparison of where Auckland has gone since 2016 compared to Wellington and Christchurch and these other cities that didn't make those same reforms, either on home prices or rents? Yeah,
nominal prices. I think I'll focus on rents because I think they're the best, give us the most accurate picture of how housing costs and housing affordability are being affected. But rents have been going up steadily in Auckland, but at a much slower rate than in other large cities like Wellington, Dunedin, Christchurch, and these other places. And that's in nominal terms. In real terms, they've been falling, right, because we're now in this high inflationary period. In terms of housing affordability, of course, what really matters is not nominal price inflation, but wage inflation. And so, if people's incomes keep up with inflation, which yet to be seen, that would equate to a fall in housing costs when measured by rents. So I think those observations are encouraging, but in future work, I hope we can bring a bit more, take a more technical approach to that same basic idea and sort of use methods to pick out what are the cities most similar to Auckland and are most useful as a counterfactual to evaluate it.
Yeah, that is really promising, though. So for our last question here, there's really, as I've said, almost no precedent for this kind of thing, at least that I'm aware of in the English-speaking world. And since Auckland did this large upzoning in 2016, the entire country of New Zealand has since passed its own version of the Auckland Unitary Plan, even kind of like going further. What made this AUP upzoning and the national reform possible? Are there any lessons for those of us who would love to see this happen where they live? One thing I feel like I've heard from you here is that this sort of consolidation, agglomeration, the role of a central government seems really important. And it's something we've heard in other contexts as well. Our recent episode with Justin Coddy on social housing and how Vienna kind of had a unitary, at least provincial government to push for Red Vienna and building tons of housing. Singapore is a really good example of this, where it's been one government for 60 years or whatever. They've been able to do this. It seems like that was part of the story in Auckland, but what other thoughts do you have about how this came about and what other places can learn from it?
In terms of the unitary plan, I think it was really a unique set of conditions that are hard to replicate. It's really tied, the genesis of it was tied to this creation of a new local government that, due to its spatial planning, wanted to have a more compact city. Mm-hmm. And, that large event of the council forming perhaps allowed them some leeway to propose something that was fairly radical and ambitious. And of course, once it was announced, there was very much a public backlash against it. Not from everybody, but it's certainly the case that a lot of people were unhappy what was being proposed there. So I think that's difficult to replicate. It's more the centralization where a higher government up the food chain is really pushing for and incentivizing upzoning to occur. And so that's what's happened with this second national, actually it's our third, I guess, significant upzoning event in New Zealand. The so-called medium density residential standard is its technical term, but basically that said that the norm for planning in our 6 largest metropolitan areas, cities, should be 3 dwellings per site and 3 stories. So Auckland has taken that and made mixed housing urban, that zone we were talking about earlier, the norm, right? And so councils can work back from that and have, lower density zones, but they have to justify it, like coastal inundation or a floodplain, or there are allowances for special character in there. But at least the message is the norm of, most of your residential areas should be allowing 3 stories.
It matters where you set the default.
Exactly. And so that's recently come in, and that was a bipartisan effort. Both the centre-left Labour government was in charge, but the announcement was made by leaders of both the centre-left Labour Party and the centre-right National Party. And that political commitment really signals to the population that this is happening, right? Mm-hmm. You can imagine that if one party announces it and it's highly unpopular and the other party sees a pathway back to power, that maybe I don't find this policy credible, so I'm not going to adjust my behaviour now. And that credibility, I think, is really important. Businesses hate uncertainty. Developers really want to know. Imagine being a developer, you buy this plot of land because you're going to redevelop it, and then you find the government's changed and, well, the value of it's dropped significantly. Mm-hmm. I understand that centralisation may, the decisions being made by a central government or a state government rather by local government is unappealing to a lot of people. But I think there's an analogy here to be made with issues like climate change. The future generations don't get a vote, right? The unborn don't get a vote, just like with how cities develop. Our younger generation, if they're under 18, they don't get a vote, and all those people those potential future residents of Auckland don't get a vote either, right? And so the decisions we're making today really have to take into account the well-being and the welfare of the people not here yet. It's a bit more acute in the case of housing affordability because, you have millennials that are priced out of the market. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of us here already. But in those instances, I think there is an ethical argument for government to be making, centralised government to be taking that into account in how they make decisions. Because otherwise we're just stuck in this collective action problem, a prisoner's dilemma, where the outcome, if we all act in our own narrow self-interest, is the worst outcome.
Well, I like that as a closing message. It's yet another argument against our system of local control and everyone getting to do whatever they want, regardless of the consequences for everyone else and the future. So, Ryan Greenaway-McGrevy, thank you so much for coming on the Housing Voice podcast.
Oh, this has been terrific. Thank you so much, guys, for having me on. Great to meet you and to chat with you about what's been happening here in Auckland.
You can read more about Ryan's research on our website, lewis.ucla.edu. Show notes and a transcript of the interview are there too. The UCLA Lewis Center is on Facebook and Twitter. I'm on Twitter at Shane D. Phillips, and Pavo is at El Pavo. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.